The lights of the chamber had dimmed slightly, not by design, but because the tension in the room felt too thick for full brightness. The Supreme Court had just adjourned for a special post-session panel on constitutional integrity. What was meant to be ceremonial had become combustible. Because Denzel Washington was in the building. He wasn't invited as an actor, or even as an activist, but as a citizen who had something to say. The request came through back channels, and to everyone's surprise, Chief Justice John Roberts agreed. The moment Denzel walked into the hall, the energy fractured. Not hostile, just unsettled. A man known for portraying flawed heroes had come, not to perform, but to confront. Roberts adjusted his glasses as Denzel took the adjacent seat on the raised dais. The Chief Justice opened with pleasantries. "We welcome all voices." Denzel interrupted, calm and razor-sharp. "You don't welcome all voices. You tolerate a few when it's politically convenient." A quiet gasp. Not from the front, but from the staff rows in the back. Roberts turned slightly. "Mr. Washington, we are here for discourse, not accusation." "You've had decades for discourse," Denzel replied. "And what did you do when states rolled back rights in plain daylight? You looked the other way and called it jurisprudence." A pause. Roberts leaned back, controlled. "You speak with passion. But passion is not precedent." Denzel smiled without warmth. "And silence isn't justice." That line shifted the room. Not shouted, just delivered. Measured. Irrefutable. "I watched your court gut the Voting Rights Act with surgical coldness. I watched you rule neutrality while extremists wrote the script. You may wear the robe, Mr. Roberts, but the people wear the cost." Roberts' eyes narrowed. "You're simplifying decades of legal history." "I'm simplifying nothing," Denzel snapped, still poised. "I'm making it plain. Because too many people think plain truth is too much." He turned to the audience. "When the law becomes a maze no citizen can walk without being punished, that's not law. That's control." The chamber fell silent again. Not out of fear. But recognition. And Denzel wasn't finished. Roberts cleared his throat, clearly unsettled but trained to hide it. "Mr. Washington, this is not a courtroom." Denzel leaned forward slightly, voice even. "Good. Because in a courtroom, too many people don't stand a chance." The room tightened again. Even the reporters, used to the slow drone of legal commentary, began typing faster. "You say this isn't a courtroom," Denzel continued, "but justice isn't just a building or a bench. It's what people feel, or don't, when they walk away from it." Roberts adjusted his posture. "Our rulings are interpretations of the Constitution. Not emotional reactions to current events." Denzel's eyes burned with focus. "That's the problem. You treat pain like a distraction. But the Constitution wasn't meant to be cold. It was meant to be corrected. That's why it begins with we the people, not we the privileged." A few quiet nods from the audience, barely perceptible, but present. Roberts tried again. "My role is not to legislate empathy." "No," Denzel said, cutting in. "But your silence has written more opinions than your pen ever did." That landed hard. "You watched gerrymandering slice communities apart, and shrugged. You watched voting access dwindle, and called it federalism. You let money flood elections like poison and said nothing because it wasn't the court's place. But now the people are drowning, and you're dry as parchment." A flicker of something crossed Robert's face, not guilt, perhaps, but discomfort. "You once said, judges are like umpires. They don't make the rules, they apply them," Denzel said. "But when the game is rigged, silence from the umpire is a rule." The audience murmured, and cameras zoomed in. "Let me ask you something," Denzel continued, voice dropping just a bit. "When history writes your name, will it say you protected liberty? Or that you preserved legacy?" Roberts didn't answer. Because he knew that question wasn't for him alone. Roberts shifted in his seat, the crisp pleats of his robe rustling like paper secrets. "I was appointed to interpret the Constitution, not to advocate for ideology. Denzel didn't flinch. And yet your rulings consistently serve one. The line cut cleaner than a scalpel. Ideology doesn't always come dressed in flags or fists, Denzel continued. Sometimes it comes wearing a calm tone, a black robe, and a smile that says, "This is just the law." Roberts tried to steady the exchange. It's easy to criticize from the outside. I'm not outside, Denzel said sharply. I've been inside broken schools, inside underfunded courtrooms, inside jails packed with men who look like me. The only thing I've never been inside is your kind of indifference. The silence was explosive. Roberts sat frozen. The gallery leaned forward, not even pretending to be neutral anymore. Denzel rose slightly, his voice still low. You know what neutrality looks like from where I stand? It looks like watching black voters purged while calling it procedural. It looks like letting corporations write election maps with blood money and ink. It looks like refusing to hear a case that could have stopped children from being hunted in classrooms. Robert's lips parted, but no sound came out. Your legacy isn't written in legal briefs, Denzel said. It's written in who you refuse to see. In what you refuse to stop. He stepped toward the edge of the platform, looking out at the silent observers. History doesn't care how calm your voice was. It remembers who had the power, and what they chose to protect. Then, slowly, he turned back to Roberts. You weren't neutral. You were comfortable. And the weight of that sentence didn't fall like an accusation. It echoed like a verdict. Denzel stepped away from the panel table now, turning to face the audience directly. He didn't ask for permission. He just owned the room. I've met your rulings, he said, voice steady but with fire rising beneath the surface. They don't wear robes. They wear uniforms. Orange ones. They're 15, sometimes 13, locked up for stealing snacks, while Wall Street launders billions and walks free. The weight of his words hit harder than any gavel. I've met your rulings in mothers working 3 jobs because union protections were gutted. In kids whose schools became pipelines to prison. In neighborhoods redlined by policy, not accident. He turned slightly toward Roberts but didn't look directly at him. You don't meet them, do you? Roberts remained silent. Every eye was on him, yet the power in the room had shifted entirely. You write doctrine like it's poetry, Denzel said. You say it's not personal. But it is. It always is. He pointed gently toward a young man in the gallery. That kid there, he doesn't read Supreme Court decisions. But your silence just decided how many polling stations he gets in his zip code. A few gasps broke out. Some of them were personal. Some of them were guilty. Justice isn't supposed to be remote. It's supposed to reach. Denzel looked straight at Roberts now. You write like history isn't watching. But history isn't quiet. It waits. And when it speaks, it won't just remember your titles. It'll remember the people your rulings forgot. Roberts sat still, a statue draped in authority, but chipped, just enough for everyone to see the cracks. Denzel stepped back toward the long table, his eyes never leaving the judge. The chamber was now more than a room, it had become a pressure chamber, and Roberts sat at its epicenter. You sit high above the rest of us, Denzel said. Literally. Symbolically. Intentionally. He tapped the table once, slowly. But justice doesn't mean distance. It doesn't mean hiding behind marble walls or legal jargon no one understands but the elite. He took a breath, not to calm himself, but to center the weight of what came next. I've stood on sets that look like courtrooms. Pretend walls. Fake verdicts. But at least those came with a script that ended in dignity. Yours don't. A hush spread again, not respectful, but haunted. You wear a robe, Mr. Roberts, but too often, you wield it like a curtain. One that hides the machinery grinding up everyday people. Roberts' jaw tensed. Denzel pressed further. Where were you when states built voter ID laws designed to trap the working poor? Where were you when prison contracts depended on keeping beds filled, and sentences lengthened? He stepped even closer to the dais. You weren't neutral. You were absent. The room didn't move. The air didn't stir. Let me ask you, Denzel continued, voice sharp but slow, how many protests do you watch from your chambers? How many funerals of policies you upheld do you attend? How many people do you rule over without ever knowing their names? He paused, then delivered the final blow. You call it interpretation. I call it insulation. Roberts shifted in his chair. For the first time, he looked small. The authority of his robe still wrapped around him. But for everyone watching, it no longer made him bigger. Denzel didn't sit back down. He stood there, tall, still, surgical. You ever see a mother kneel beside her son's casket after a traffic stop? He asked, not looking at Roberts anymore, but at the wall behind him, like the entire institution was being addressed now. You ever explain judicial restraint to a family who just buried a teenager? He turned back slowly, like a pivot in a closing argument. I have. The words dropped like stone in water. I've held the hands of parents who lost everything because one ruling shifted the scales. Not because of evidence. Not because of guilt. But because of process. Because somewhere in that building, a decision was made, to wait. Roberts looked down at his folded hands, but it wasn't humility. It was evasion. Let me ask you, Denzel said, voice tightening, when you strike down protections, when you remand hope back to lower courts, do you know who you're sending back into the storm? He didn't wait for a reply. I met a teacher last year. She lost her job when the ruling on labor unions shifted. I met a child whose health care vanished because your court let states opt out of expansion. I met a veteran whose ballot was discarded because he forgot to sign the back of an envelope. Denzel's voice dropped to a whisper. You sat on the bench, and their lives went under it. He paused. You've weighed constitutional clauses. You've balanced legal tests. But tell me honestly, whose lives did you weigh? For a moment, even the cameras seemed to blink slower. The silence wasn't awkward. It was indictment. The air inside the chamber was thick now, thicker than before, not just with political weight but with something deeper. Denzel stood just to the right of the main podium, where a press secretary had been scheduled to deliver notes. He wasn't supposed to be there, but no one dared to stop him now. The echo of his previous words hadn't left the marble walls. Justice Roberts remained seated at the center of the judicial panel, his fingers laced tightly, as if holding back not just emotion, but reaction. You don't get to wear that robe and pretend it makes you untouchable, Denzel said slowly, his voice low but strong. Because history doesn't care about robes. It remembers decisions. The courtroom gallery, usually numb to political drama, was now hanging on every syllable. You could hear the shift in breath, the tightening of backs, as if the entire room knew something irreversible was happening. Justice Roberts narrowed his eyes. You presume much, Mr. Washington. I presume what I've lived, Denzel shot back. I presume that when a man in Mississippi is jailed for protesting, when a woman in Texas loses access to care, when a black teenager is sentenced by a judge quoting scripture but ignoring facts, someone up there signed off. Robert's jaw moved, clenched hard, but he didn't interrupt. Not yet. And I don't care, Denzel added, how many citations you can stack, or how well you deliver a verdict in that polished tone of yours. Because if your judgment echoes in the empty stomach of a mother who just got evicted, then your silence becomes complicity. Gasps rippled through the benches. Even a few clerks behind Roberts flinched, not out of fear, but recognition. You're a Supreme Court justice, Denzel said, walking slowly, controlled. But justice isn't a title. It's a test. And right now, a lot of people believe you're failing. Roberts finally stood, breaking protocol. You are dangerously close to contempt. And you're dangerously close to forgetting who you serve, Denzel said, not backing down an inch. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure of what to do. A low murmur passed through the audience. Phones weren't allowed, but memories were recording every second. I'm not here to perform, Denzel said once more, turning to face the gallery. I'm here to remind everyone watching that robes don't absolve you from responsibility. And silence isn't neutral. It's an answer. One that history will absolutely judge. He turned back to Roberts with one final stare, not angry, not dramatic, just present. And powerful. Some of us fight with words. Others with decisions. Either way, the clock's running. The Chief Justice didn't sit back down. Not right away. His posture was tight, hands gripping the edge of the bench as if the solid oak beneath him could provide some kind of grounding. But it couldn't, not anymore. The words Denzel had thrown down weren't rhetorical sparks. They were facts, sharpened by experience and hurled like daggers into the silence that men like Roberts had long mistaken for order. You speak as if the judiciary has failed in its duty, Roberts finally said, voice dry, as if every syllable cost him. Denzel didn't miss a beat. No, he said calmly. I speak because you've succeeded, in protecting power, not people. Roberts looked out over the crowd, perhaps hoping to find sympathy. But all he saw were eyes. Watching. Measuring. The Constitution doesn't bend to emotion, he said, trying to reassert his ground. It stands as a framework beyond the tides of outrage. Denzel took a step forward. The Constitution was written by people who once owned slaves. It was corrected by people who knew better. And it must keep being corrected by those who see better. Roberts opened his mouth to reply, but Denzel kept going. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through everything. You say emotion is dangerous? Try ignoring it and see what happens. Try ignoring entire communities begging for their humanity to be recognized. See how long your rulings hold when the people underneath them are breaking. The tension in the room was electric now. Even staffers behind the bench leaned in unconsciously. This wasn't a courtroom drama, it was a confrontation with time itself. I was raised in neighborhoods where people don't quote legal precedents, Denzel said. They quote funerals. Prison sentences. Evictions. They live by the rulings you sign and survive in the gaps you leave. Robert's face had paled. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. And yet you continue to decide from a place untouched by consequence, Denzel said. Your idea of balance isn't justice, it's distance. A few quiet murmurs from the audience now, affirmation, maybe even relief. Like someone had finally said what needed saying, and said it without blinking. You think robes give you immunity from reality. But they don't. They only give you insulation. And insulation doesn't make you wise. It makes you blind. Denzel paused, then pointed to the emblem above Robert's seat, equal justice under law. He smiled coldly. That looks good up there. But it means nothing if it never reaches down here. The weight of that sentence didn't fade, it stayed. It sat in the room like judgment itself. And for the first time, Chief Justice Roberts had no reply. Denzel took a deep breath, but it wasn't to calm himself, it was to remind them he was still in control. And right now, control didn't belong to the marble, or the gavel, or the bench. It belonged to truth. And truth had chosen its messenger. You know what the real danger is, Justice Roberts? He asked, eyes narrowing. It's not activism. It's apathy dressed in tradition. That line landed like a slap. The justices beside Roberts remained frozen, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to align themselves with the cold center of the storm. You tell us the court isn't political, Denzel continued, slowly walking the front of the room like a preacher pacing the altar. But every time you shield power under the excuse of restraint, you pick a side. Every time you ignore precedent to satisfy donors in robes, you pick a side. Every time you close your ears to the cries of the voiceless, you pick a side. He pointed toward the gallery, not at any single person, but at the sea of faces, old and young, tired and hopeful. The people don't need your legacy, he said. They need your courage. Roberts finally spoke, and this time, the veil dropped just a little. I swore an oath to the law. Denzel stopped. Turned. And I swore one to life. Now it was silent. I swore an oath to my children, to the students I've spoken to the families I've visited, to the names carved into headstones because the system crushed them while the court watched. His voice didn't rise, it fell into a dangerous calm. You think your detachment is noble? It's not. It's fatal. The lights above flickered faintly, or maybe it was just the tension warping the air. A few people in the gallery wiped their eyes. One man whispered, "Say it," under his breath. "You're not leading from the law anymore," Denzel said, stepping one final pace forward. "You're hiding behind it." And then he paused, one last time, to deliver it. When history puts your name beside your decisions, there won't be footnotes to explain what you ignored. There will only be faces. Empty chairs at dinner tables. Dreams stamped, denied. And one line next to your title. He stared straight into Robert's eyes. He chose silence. Denzel turned back to the audience one final time, but his voice didn't carry desperation, it carried judgment. The kind that didn't need robes or gavels. The kind that echoed beyond courtrooms. "There's a lie that's been whispered in this chamber for decades," he said slowly. "That justice is neutral. That rulings are clean. That consequences are someone else's problem." He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, the words etched in stone, "Equal justice under law." "I've watched men build careers hiding behind those words," he continued. "I've watched them deliver decisions like bullets and call it interpretation. I've seen communities dismantled, rights stripped away, lives erased, all under the guise of balance." He turned to Roberts again, slower now, deliberate. "You had the power to shift the direction of this country. And time after time, you chose the shadows." The room had become still in a way that didn't feel natural. It felt sacred. Like something irreversible was happening. "I'm not here to rewrite law," Denzel said. "I'm here because people who look like me, who believe like me, who fight like me, are tired of bleeding in the footnotes of your opinions." He stepped closer to the bench, and though there was no physical threat, you could feel the emotional force behind every word. "You won't be remembered for how politely you ruled," he said. "You'll be remembered for what you refused to see. For every child who sat in a broken classroom because you dismantled education equity. For every voice suppressed by maps you approved. For every dream deferred under policies you called restraint." Roberts didn't answer. He didn't blink. For the first time, he looked like a man who had heard his own legacy spoken aloud, and didn't recognize it. Denzel's voice dropped, just above a whisper now. But every word cut. "History won't whisper your name, Justice Roberts. It'll shout it, with disappointment." Then, slowly, he turned away, not defeated, not tired, but done. Because the real verdict had been delivered, not by a court, but by the people. As Denzel walked off the stage, the audience rose, not with cheers, not with applause, but with the kind of silence that only truth can command. And somewhere, far beyond the walls of that courtroom, a page of history turned, and the ink was permanent. When justice wears a robe but forgets its heart, the people remember. Denzel didn't walk into that courtroom to make noise, he walked in to make history. This wasn't just a clash of words, it was a collision between comfort and consequence. If you felt that truth cut deep today, don't just watch, witness. Because what just happened wasn't theater. It was accountability.